What I wanted to talk a little bit today about is communication and how in this day and age, those in this room can separate the signal from the noise. This type of communication, it's the best. As the Administrator Manning spoke of, getting people together to discuss substance, there's no substitute for that. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is how you communicate your thoughts and ideas with the rest of the world. I'm not a PowerPoint guy, as Pat said, but more importantly, the world in which we're entering, you don't have slides. Your device, 50% of news and information today is consumed on this device. It's grown about 5% a year, 10 years, the 20th anniversary of this program. If you can't communicate your thoughts and ideas on this, it's not going to matter. Now, communication is not just the tools and technologies, it's making sure you talk a common language. And I'll start with a story early in my career in many years ago. At the ripe age of 33, 94, I was appointed by the Clinton administration to go do some things in Russia, everything from decommissioning nuclear weapons to help Russia transition to a market economy. 3 days on the job. I didn't have a staff yet. I received a telex from then Secretary of State Christopher. I'm old enough to remember those kind of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the telex that came off. And he said, please go meet with the mayor of St. Petersburg. We think he's a reformer, and see what you can get going there. Happened to be a transit strike, so I made my way from Moscow to St. Petersburg, planes, trains, and automobiles, and went to see this man. And we wound up in a very heated discussion about what we could bring in terms of economic assistance to business. Our strategy at the time was we thought a transition to a market economy would bring with it democracy, would bring with it an empowerment of the Russian people. Fairly standard playbook America brings to most parts of the world. We got in a heated argument. I kept saying it's important that these enterprises ultimately have a profit. He objected quite strenuously. We had a heated argument, and I changed the topic to something like Russian hockey because at the ripe age of 33, I thought I can't lose my job 3 days in. I just can't have this guy calling Secretary Christopher and saying, who's this crazy man you sent over here? We can't agree on anything. So I walked out, turned to my interpreter, and I'd borrowed a proficient UN-level interpreter from the then ambassador in Moscow. And I asked him, what do you think we were arguing about? What do you think I was trying to say? What does profit mean to you? And he says, it's simple. Profit is when you take advantage of someone. Now think about this. This was a Russian-born linguist, quite fluent in English, but he'd never had a lemonade stand. He didn't think through revenues less costs equals profit. The only kind of profit he knew was very prevalent in the Soviet system, which was taking advantage of somebody else. Good lesson for me about communicating. Now I got another lesson the next day because I figured I had to go back, having miscommunicated. Spent all that time trying to share what was going on in my head, realizing this mayor's head was very different in a different place. I tried to see him. He wouldn't see me. So he had me see his then deputy, Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, then the vice mayor of St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. Vladimir Putin excused my translator, my staff, and it was he, his staffer, and me, and he cut to the chase. He said, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, I've seen your background. I know you've had success in Wall Street. The only reason you could possibly be coming here is to make money. And as long as you give me half of what you make here, you can do anything you want. We had a common language. We couldn't strike much of a bargain, but we had a common language. So as you think about what we're going to talk this morning about communication, let's remember this is an easy audience to communicate with. You're serious people, you're informed, you do your homework, you're ultimately ascribing and signing up for that same mission. Most people you have to communicate with aren't as well informed, don't speak even the same language. Now I'm going to talk for a minute about what I found when I went to the Times. And I went to the Times, as Pat said, as a civic mission. I think at its heart, at its roots, local journalism, newspapers are the foundation of our society. Bob Schieffer, a fairly well-known CBS national, international television journalist, was asked when he stepped down recently after a distinguished 50-year career, what he feared most in the future of journalism. And it wasn't the hostage-taking of journalists in ISIS. It wasn't the polarization of Fox News and MSNBC. It was the dearth and the death of local journalism. I had the good fortune recently to host Marty Barron, who's the editor of the Washington Post, formerly of the Boston Globe, the screenwriter for this movie called Spotlight. Spotlight, if you haven't seen it by the way, is a very powerful movie about the tragedy in the Catholic Church and the abuse of young men, young boys by priests. It's a story of challenging, holding accountable one of the most powerful institutions in the world, but at its roots, it's one local journalist. And that foundation in much of our community starts with a newspaper. Take Los Angeles as an example. Los Angeles has, at the Times, even today, after all the cuts, 10 times the number of journalists reside at the Los Angeles Times as the rest of the other news organizations in Los Angeles combined. Just stop on that fact for a sec. So Los Angeles, the second biggest city in the country, the one institution has 10 times the number of journalists as the rest cumulatively. So you may see your work chronicled on NBC, the noon news, you may hear about it on public radio, you may see it in some other form of media, but at its roots, the story probably begins with that local paper. Now, when I got to the Times, and still today, the transition from an old monopoly business to the world of noise, to the digital arena, is not going well for most newspapers. The print form factor worked well, and judging by the age of this audience, I'm assuming many of you are newspaper readers, and it works. Think about it. If our delivery person misses your driveway, throws it in the bushes, you'll look for it. And if you can't find it in the bushes, you'll actually call. As publisher, I get calls each and every day from subscribers saying, I can't start my day without the newspaper. Can you please deliver it again? Is there any website, when you get up in the morning and it's down, you call that company? BuzzFeed, your website's not up, I can't start my day? No. There's nothing like the newspaper. And the engagement worked. Average customer would spend about a half hour. They'd read through, they might open looking for the latest sports scores, they might read about the presidential primaries in Indiana. Along the way, serendipity allowed them to see what else is happening in their world. And it also worked for advertisers. The illusion was maintained as you're flipping those pages, you might actually look at the ads. It worked. Now let's transition to the world of digital. The average time someone spends looking at news and information on this device is between 4 and 5 minutes. It's gone from a half hour to 4 and 5 minutes. A newspaper website could only have been created by someone who used to be in the print business. What they did was take the 300 or 400 stories on average you find in a print newspaper, or at least a major metropolitan newspaper. They doubled that number, and they digitized them. They put it up on a website. Anybody want to hazard a guess what portion of those stories are looked at by the average digital consumer of a newspaper website? Less than 1%. So let's think of a metaphor for a print newspaper. Maybe it's an old grocery store. You get sent off, your spouse sends you, bring home the milk and the bananas. And on the way to checkout, you always grab something you didn't see. It might be fish, fresh produce, it might be Oreo cookies, but you buy something other than the milk, other than the bananas, and other than the bread. It kind of worked. That newspaper website today is that grocery store with the windows painted over, the front doors locked, and the milk and the bananas on the curb. You're never going to find the Oreos, you're never going to see the fresh fish, you're not going to bring home vegetables. So that world's transitioning. The transition's incomplete, it's going to be rocky, it's going to be rough. But as you think about how to communicate what you do, those thoughts and ideas, and have an important conversation with the public at large, you're going to have to change the way you do your work. A few fundamentals to think about. I was with the head of the California stem cell effort the other day. It was the 10th anniversary of that effort, roughly, 11 years now, about 10 or 11 years. And he was suggesting that the LA Times should chronicle their trials, tribulations, and what's happened. I said, that is a wonderful idea. We don't have anybody at the LA Times who has the foggiest notion of what you do. So I could ask some young reporter to come to your office. They'd sit for 45 minutes, they'd take furious notes. And you will think you've imparted a decade's worth of knowledge. Go back to that Russia example, right? He thinks, well, everything I know has somehow come through this 45-minute funnel. That reporter's written it down. Not much will happen the next 3 weeks. You'll call me and you'll say, what happened in that story? And I'll call to the editor who'll call that reporter. They'll call one of your staffers, maybe a second source somewhere, and you'll wake up the next morning, you'll read this story and you go, there's not much there, they missed it entirely. I said, yeah, those 3 weeks in the interim, they were working on 6 other stories. You had this illusion that they were working on your story. But in reality, we're not staffed to cover the complex issues of today. So my advice to him, which I think works for this audience, which is you have to write the story. I'm not talking about write the story as in a press release, this is what we want the headline to say. I'm talking about you have to provide a toolkit to those news organizations who don't have the staffs they used to have, who don't live in a parallel universe with you like a sports reporter used to travel with the Dodgers for many years, or public safety. In the old days, Los Angeles Times used to have a team of 25 people covering the city and county. It's less than 5 today, less than 5. They would have had someone who more or less hung out with the chief. Whatever the chief was doing that day, chief of police, that reporter would be doing. Now we're lucky, or Times would be lucky if there's a reporter who even knows the chief. So you're going to have to think of what do they need to do their work. You're going to have to deliver them the research. You're going to have to deliver them the context. You're going to have to deliver them the trials and your tribulations. In talking to my friend at the stem cell agency, I said, don't just deliver to this reporter the 3 things that have worked. They're cynics. Reporters are cynics. Be sure to tell them 2 or 3 that didn't work and why, what you've learned, what you're going to do differently. So first lesson, kind of an awkward one, but you're going to have to do their work. The second, and this is maybe a more encouraging one, is those same tools are available to you. Think about today after Indiana. Right, the 2 insurgent candidates, and let's put aside politics and let's not have a lengthy discussion of why they're the insurgents, but you have 2 candidates who more or less came from nowhere, weren't part of the political establishment, were the 2 biggest vote getters. Why is that? One could talk about the politics behind it and perhaps the dissatisfaction with government and big institutions, but one should also talk about the ability to communicate one's ideas directly. Go back to that newspaper. The newspaper was the monopoly. If people wanted to find out about the world around them, they walked down their driveway and picked up the newspaper. Maybe they turned on the nightly news. Those were the funnels. Now people communicate directly. The millennial generation consumes 75% of their news in social media. There's no intermediation anymore. That can work for you. You can communicate directly. You can be Bernie Sanders. You can be Donald Trump. You can communicate your thoughts and ideas directly. Now you got to start first with this. Okay, no one's going to read a 20-page policy paper you put up online. Nobody. Sorry. They might in this room. They should in this room. That's what this room's all about. But if you're trying to communicate with the world at large, think about how it's going to come out on this. I'll give you an example of something which I think is a very effective transition from the old world to the newer world. The most successful piece of digital journalism today, and I talk about it as a business, not whether you like the journalism or not, is something called the Daily Playbook by Mike Allen from Politico. For those of you who live in the Washington series of concentric circles, you probably get it. It's a daily email. Mike Allen used to be a very successful columnist at the Washington Post. He's still a very esteemed journalist. He took his talents to an organization called Politico, which is all digital, and he publishes a daily email. That daily email looks like it might have been a column in the old days. Here's 8 or 10 ideas, thoughts. Here's what's happening in Washington. Here's the pulse of the Beltway. Less than 100,000 subscribers. The advertising revenue of that newsletter in excess of $4 million a year. Now, I'll try to put that in a little context. My first day at the LA Times, Robin Williams passed away. It was a tragedy. The second day, we had a record spike in internet traffic on our website, a record spike. We had almost 10 million viewers from around the world come read that story. So the editor invited me to the morning newsroom, which looks like about half this room, I guess. So all the senior editors, and they wanted to have a celebration, and they wanted me to shout out to my social media, my four kids and my wife who follow me, the great success we were having, and that we were number one. We actually had the number one story on the web. 10 million people read it. Give you some sense of magnitude of what that meant. In the world of noise, the seemingly infinite number of digital impressions that's being created each day, an advertiser will pay something less than $1 per 1,000 impressions. So I sell you 1,000 impressions, you give me $1. Those 10 million impressions garnered the vast bounty of $10,000. So what was meant to be a celebration with the newsroom became kind of sobering when I explained to them the newsroom costs about $100 million a year to run, and if a record day for us was $10,000 of revenue, that doesn't work, right? We don't have to do all that math. I think this room can figure that one out. If a record day is $10,000, it's not going to work. So Mike Allen is onto something, which is engagement, and I think that's where this room starts to connect with the world at large, which is you have context, you have ideas, you can help explain the world around us, you can help it make sense, and you can help move people to action. And what I think you will see in the coming weeks, months, and years is an increasing bifurcation in journalism. There will be no shortage of impressions, the BuzzFeeds of the world, the listicles, the water skiing squirrels, and the people with their hair on fire. That's not your audience. It never was. It never will be. And don't be distracted by it. Your audience is those who seek to be engaged, who seek to be informed, and will take the time to engage around a series of thoughts and ideas. Because you can access digital distribution as easily as BuzzFeed, or as easily as Pat and I, if we decided to tomorrow start our own form of journalism by talking about the issues involved in Homeland Security, you can communicate directly. So I would challenge you as you go back to your organizations to say, well, how are we communicating with our constituency? Is it that local constituency? Is it policymakers? What channel are we trying to reach them through? And what tools are we using? Use that Mike Allen example and maybe bring it home. Should your department, should your chief, should your leadership be issuing a weekly newsletter? Here's what we're doing. Here's what we're doing. Be transparent. Here's what's working. Here's what's not working. You can self-police, if you will. You can share the challenges and struggles you're having. You'll build credibility, by the way, by doing that. If all you do is share success, your open rate on those emails won't be very high. So if it's just meant to flatter yourselves, here's 3 great things, here's our chief cutting a ribbon at a school, that's not going to get opened. But if you're honest and you share what you're trying to do, what's working, what's not, how people can make a difference, your email will get opened and you will engage your constituencies. So those tools are available and they are really, really cheap. That's the good news in this. The bad news, traditional media is going to get worse. Quote that bothers me, I guess, the most, going back to politics for the moment, the head of CBS News was asked about the Trump phenomenon. Again, I'm not being a partisan here, but I don't know that that's the way I'd like to see my kids at least be educated, informed on the civic discourse. And his comment was, not sure if it's good or bad, but it's good for our business. Good for CBS's business, maybe not so good for the country. Each of my 4 kids are teenagers, and one of them had to watch one of the presidential debates for his high school class. And that prompted an idea for my wife and I, which was we would take the chance to watch 2 of the debates with each of our children. You may not have watched them all. I watched 8 or 7.5. It's painful. But I found myself with my youngest, my 12-year-old daughter, watching a Republican debate where they got into the debate about the size of one's hand and had to turn the TV off. That's a pretty unfortunate thing in this country where I think civil discourse informed discourse on policy is really, really important to making sure you're able to do the work you need to do, keep our community safe, and think about our role in the future. If you have to turn off the TV with your 12-year-old in the room, I think we're heading for more turbulent waters. And you're going to have to develop those skills to communicate directly. So if I offered you one bit of advice, kind of basic stuff, think about language. Think about my experience in Russia. I was kidding with Pat this morning. If I could remember half the acronyms in this room as a layman, I'd be doing pretty well. So put it in terms your constituents truly can understand. Don't just talk to each other. It's the first thing you got to do. Second, try to identify that constituency as a unique constituency. And digitally, you can offer different products. You can share with them different levels. There actually might be a constituency who want to see your PowerPoint. Fantastic. Put it up online. But most of them won't. Most of them will want something simpler. And third, if you don't have someone in your organizations who's truly facile in these tools, probably on average, anybody older than about 25, you got to rehire. You got to find someone, because it's not as simple as we have this old form press release, here it is, I'm going to put it out on my Twitter feed or up on my Facebook because nobody's going to read it. The LA Times, we used to get unsolicited about 5,000 press releases a day. 5,000. You know how many got read? 0. Think about that. So you have to, in this age, change. Now the good news is, compared to the policy conversations you're having, this stuff's kind of easy. If you have the right set of skills, if you think about it, and if you ask yourself some of those basic questions. Are we communicating in a language others will understand? Have we really thought about which constituency we're trying to reach? And are we as fluent in the tools we need as our customers are? So with that, I'd love to have a conversation. I do think this is a great organization. I'm very privileged to be part of this conversation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.